In this lecture, I shall deal with two very early Christian stories. Some of you know them well, others of you may not know them that well, but they are among the oldest sources from the post-New Testament period, and they take both their point of departure in the canonical Gospels. And the two are, as mentioned, the Proto-Evangelium of James, which I will occasionally call the PJ in the following, and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which I will also, for simplicity, call IGT. Before doing so, presenting what I'm going to do, I must say a few words about the context of my presentation today. It is part of a book project with a preliminary title, The Other Side: Apocryphal Perspectives on Ancient Christian Orthodoxies. It's a book that will discuss various early Christian writings and address the question of how they may relate to some concept of orthodoxy or orthodoxies within early Christianity, or to the opposite, whether we call it heterodox or what we call it heretic, which is a more problematic term, of course. By the term or the expression "the other side" in this book title or this book project, we may loosely understand some other party, other side, some other party than the ecclesiastical elite of the time when the apocryphal writings were produced. Whether there was some kind of other elite, some other kind of elite, or others who in some way differs from or even is in conflict with what is perhaps the main side or the mainstream or whatever we call it, what became the mainstream perhaps. My lecture is to be developed into a chapter in this volume. What I shall present is very much a work in progress, and I'm therefore very open to and thankful for any kind of input I can have from you. That will really help me a lot, I think. These two apocryphal stories, the PJ and IGT, whose authors are unknown but which are ascribed to the biblical figures Thomas and James, have several features in common. First is obviously the fact that both deal with the early life of two central figures in the history of Christianity, Jesus and his mother. Second, both presuppose and expand on the infancy stories of the now canonical Gospels, with an important impetus for these expansions being general, I would say, human curiosity, with a wish to fill in the holes in the New Testament biographies of the two. Where the Gospels are silent, these somehow fill out at least parts of their biographies. Third point is that both stories are without value, as you may know already, in the quest for the historical Jesus and the historical Mary. Instead, their historical value lies inter alia in how they reflect the later reception of these two figures and how they mirror the historical settings in which the stories came into being. Fourth similarity is that both have their origin in the 2nd century and in a Greek-speaking area, or mainly Greek-speaking area. Furthermore, both stories are in the tradition surrounded by a cluster of related material, by stories or fragments of stories or single episodes on the early life of Mary and Jesus respectively. Material that reflect the long-term popularity of this material. And finally, as a common point between the two, and importantly, both have had a somewhat untidy or even problematic relationship to the early mainstream, if we can talk about mainstream, Christian theology. I'm acutely aware of the problems inherent in this term, of course. As a consequence of these and also other common features, the two infancy Gospels are in scholarship as well as on the popular scene often dealt with together. At the same time, the early Christian traditions on Mary's and Jesus' childhood, which have materialized in the Proto-Evangelium of James and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, are in a number of respects quite different. Some of these differences we shall return to later, since they are highly relevant to what I shall be dealing with here. The question as to how and to what extent the two stories give expression to some kind of other side. There will be many question marks here, or citation marks. Other side, whether theologically or otherwise, in the history of early Christianity. Indeed, the differences may also be seen as so great that pairing the two can be regarded quite artificial. Nonetheless, I think that combining the two will make sense in our context, as I intend to show. In the following, I shall give a survey of ancient and modern perceptions of the respective theological profiles of the two infancy Gospels, with a particular view to their orthodoxy and or their non-orthodoxy or heterodoxy. This will serve as my point of departure for presenting some characteristic features of the text. In doing this, I will also make use of a couple of central text passages from the two Gospels. My aim will be to argue that the stories, each in their way and from their own angle, can throw light on the topic of early Christian orthodoxies, or the opposite, heterodoxy. And the aspect that I want to bring into special focus here is the issue of social context. The relevance of social setting for the interpretation of these stories and their theology. Hopefully, this can add some useful and important nuances to the discussion of this topic. And then first, a little on PJ and its reception and research history. The PJ, Proto-Evangelium of James, may have come into existence a little later than the infancy Gospel of Thomas. Maybe in the second half of the 2nd century or early 3rd century. I will nonetheless start with this Gospel, since it from a narrative point of view is prior to Thomas. It describes the background and early life of Jesus' mother Mary. The story can be divided in 3 main parts. The first 8 chapters deals with Mary's parents, her conception, birth and childhood until she is 12. The second part, from chapter 8 to 16 approximately, describes the establishment of her relationship with Joseph, her pregnancy, and her and Joseph's acquittal from the accusation of adultery. The last part, chapters 17 to 24, largely expands on the infancy stories in Matthew 1 to 2 and Luke 1 to 2. And it describes, with a number of deviations from the canonical stories, Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, the visit of the Magi, the slaughter of the infants, and the death of the high priest Zechariah. The description of Zechariah being one interesting deviation from the canonical Gospels. These deviations, but also many other elements, signal clearly what is a main theological concern for the author of the Proto-Evangelium. It is to underscore the purity of Mary, both her ritual, menstrual, as well as sexual purity. A central element in this is her continued virginity. She is and remains a virgin before, during, and after having given birth to Jesus. Thus, main aim, at least, the main rationale of the story is to be an apology for the perpetual virginity of Mary, and at the same time an encomium, a praise of Mary, presenting her in her purity as an ideal, to be sure an unattainable ideal to other women or to Christians more generally. The Proto-Evangelium early became very popular, and even though it never was a candidate, as we know, for the New Testament, the story spread quickly both in the West and in the East, and it has been very important for Christian piety. In the West, however, it has had a mixed history. On the one hand, it was strongly criticized by Jerome in the 4th century and 5th century for its perception of Jesus' brothers and sisters as being children of Joseph from a previous marriage. According to Jerome, brothers and sisters meant cousins, which made his contemporary popes Damasus and Innocent I condemn the Proto-Evangelium. And it was also later criticized and rejected as apocryphal in the inventory of the Galatian decree from the 6th century, maybe earlier. On the other hand, however, episodes, and at the same time, episodes from the Gospel often served as motive for ecclesial art. And it was also early translated into Latin and integrated also in the much-read Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew in the Middle Ages. In the East, the popularity of the Proto-Evangelium was even greater and more unreserved. From early on, it functioned as an inspiration for Marian piety and also as a support of the 5th century declaration at Ephesus of Mary as Theotokos, the Mother of God. The Gospel was very early translated into Syriac. The oldest preserved manuscript dates to the 5th century already. The Proto-Evangelium of James has until quite recently been relatively little dealt with in modern research, particularly as concerns its contents. This has changed somewhat only during the last 2 decades, in which discussions about genre, gender, purity, Mariology, perceptions of childbearing, and the Gospel's relation to Judaism have been central. You will find several of those references on the handout. The most important recent discussions of the Proto-Evangelium are the studies by Mary Foskett, Jennifer A. Glancy, and most recently by Lily C. Vuong from 2013. Worth special notice here is that there has for the Proto-Evangelium in recent research been little focus on the issue of orthodoxy or heterodoxy. Interestingly, and in fact somewhat, I would say, disquieting, it seems that the work in modern theological analysis has been nearly beyond suspicion of anything related to this issue. I do not think that we have good enough reasons to spare it of this. Probably the question should be asked more pressing than has been done so far, on which or whose side is the Proto-Evangelium, and on which or whose side is it not, if we are able to speak about one side and the other side at all. Next, also a sketch of the infancy Gospel of Thomas and its reception and research history. Much of this may be familiar material to many of you, but nevertheless. When we now turn then to IGT, which at least in its core has its origin in the middle of the 2nd century, it immediately becomes clear that this Gospel has a much more turbulent and controversial history than PJ. Whereas the Proto-Evangelium covers the whole of Mary's childhood from her birth to herself becoming a mother, the infancy Gospel of Thomas only covers 7 years of the life of Jesus, from age 5 and to 12. And while the Proto-Evangelium is quite brief and summary, in fact, on Mary's childhood, the infancy Gospel of Thomas deals with Jesus' early years in considerable more detail. When we survey the contents of this story, it is not difficult to understand the turbulence created by it, given its special depiction of Jesus. This story, which is shorter than the Proto-Evangelium, consists primarily of 2 types or genres of texts, namely episodes that tell about miracles performed by Jesus, and episodes that describe his visits to school in order to learn reading and writing. After a brief introduction, chapter 1, it tells of some miracles performed by Jesus as a 5-year-old in chapter 2 to 5. Then we hear of Jesus being taken to school by his father, and we hear of Jesus' great wisdom in chapters 6 to 8, followed by some more miracles in chapters 9 to 12. Then Jesus is taken to school again, now as an 8-year-old in chapters 13 to 14, followed by 2 final miracle stories, 15 and 16. And the Gospel ends with a retelling of Jesus in the temple at 12 in chapter 17, in a version which is very close to that of the Gospel of Luke. What primarily makes the story controversial, at least to a modern mind, is Jesus' behavior on a number of occasions. Some of the miracles that he performs consist of cursing persons who have in various ways offended him, mostly children, but also a teacher, with the result that they wither away or even die. And although Jesus, from the middle of the gospel, seems to change strategy from cursing and killing to blessing and healing, and even to making some of them come alive again, the impression is left of a rather strange Jesus figure who seems to deviate markedly from the New Testament depiction of him. In spite of what we see as strange or even problematic features in IGT's portrait of Jesus in its Christology, the Gospel in fact enjoyed broad popularity in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. It is referred to in various sources from different parts of the Greco-Roman world already in the 2nd to 4th centuries, and was translated into Latin already in the 2nd or 3rd century, into Syriac in the 3rd to 4th century, and not much later into other languages. Some of the early mentions are neutral, matter-of-fact references to the Gospel, whereas others, not unsurprisingly perhaps, are of a more critical nature. The earliest critical comment is by Irenaeus of Lyons, in his Against Heresies from the about 180 CE. Irenaeus links the Gospel and a number of other, mostly unspecified stories up with his Gnostic adversaries, in this case the Marcosians, but without developing on his claim. The next critical ancient source is John Chrysostom in his homilies on John in the late 4th century, by the end of the 4th century. However, John Chrysostom's reason for criticism is that the miracles performed by Jesus as a child contradict what is said in the Gospel of John in the passage on the wedding in Cana. Namely, that the wine miracle in Cana was the first of Jesus' miracles, so he couldn't have done miracles as a child. The next sources, and the latest to be mentioned here, which reject the infancy gospel as being non-canonical, are the already mentioned Decretum Gelatianum and a passage in Timothy on Constantinople's De Receptione Haereticiorum in late 6th century, which both are inventories of writings that should be regarded apocryphal. Interestingly, the sources to speak negatively of the infancy gospel of Thomas are few, and importantly, none of them explain or justify this with its depiction of Jesus. It is in fact primarily with modern research that we come upon more specific assessments and also negative value judgments of the Gospel's Christology. For example, as an enfant terrible who seldom acts in a Christian way, which is said in one commentary on it. It is quite a paradox that the ones most critical toward IGT are not the early Christian sources with its church leaders and decrees, but scholars representing 20th century research on the Gospel. Until recently, there have, within research, been a variety of attempts at categorizing IGT theologically, and particularly with labels such as Gnostic, Docetic, Manichaean, Jewish Christian, and Ebionite, some of which categories are mutually exclusive. The Gnosticism theory has been the most persistent within scholarship, but it has been contested by many, and I would maintain has now been refuted and made obsolete. In addition to the theological aspects, particularly the Gospel's Christology and its depiction of Jesus as a child, studies of its contents has been limited, in fact. With my book, here's the commercial, The Childhood of Jesus, Decoding the Apocryphal Infancy Gospel of Thomas being one book, the text critical edition by Tony Burke also being an important book, very important book, from 2010, and the recent Christ Child, Cultural Memories of a Young Jesus by Stephen Davis from 2014, being the most recent monography on the writing. Okay, then I'll go to a status quo overview of research and also introduce some kind of approach that I try to call a new, or at least a revived approach, which has to do with focusing on the social level or background of these writings. This very brief survey has made it clear that both infancy gospels enjoyed broad popularity in late antiquity and also during the Middle Ages. At the same time, the stories were also criticized and even on some occasions met with rejection, particularly on a theological basis, but on different grounds or with differing justifications. Both have been accused of reflecting heretical views, but then in quite different ways. Some of the same attitudes can also be recognized in modern research, but there are also differences. Very little has been done on the matter of orthodoxy, heterodoxy as concerns the Proto-Evangelium, whereas this has been a central discussion as concerns the infancy gospel of Thomas. Thus, the status quo in the case of the Proto-Evangelium is that it has escaped scholarly scrutiny on this matter, whereas the infancy gospel of Thomas has not, but with scholarship presently having ended up in some kind of limbo. The gospel does not fit into any of the traditional heresy or heterodoxy or whatever molds. Rather, it appears that this gospel too, like the Proto-Evangelium, should, despite its special traits, be placed in some variant of an early Christian tradition stream, or maybe even mainstream. Quotation marks again. Thus, both Gospels seem within research to be in need of a reorientation or reinterpretation as concerns their context. In the following, I shall propose a way in which we may meet this need. In my view, some of the problem has been that research on this early Christian material has neglected one important aspect, namely the aspect of social level or class. Class, I admit, is a problematic term, even though I shall be using it on occasions in the following. And I mean it in quite a neutral sense, or use it in a neutral sense. Instead, research has focused on other, admittedly obviously important aspects, particularly of the Gospels, particularly on theology, for example, Christology or Mariology. Research has also focused on gender, male-female roles in the Gospels, and on ethnicity or geographical provenance, whether they come from Greek, Syrian, or other kinds of regions or language areas. In my view, however, as I've argued in my book, The Childhood of Jesus, attention should also be paid to social level as a factor in the interpretation of these stories. Paying attention to this would mean to take into account matters such as ancient social hierarchies, demography, educational levels, and the axis urban and rural. When we turn to research literature on matters such as these, it comes as a surprise that there seems to have been done relatively little on this in recent years, on matters related to social level, social context, particularly on the matter then of level and if you use the term class. In the otherwise impressive the Oxford Handbook of Social Relations in the Roman World from 2011, edited by Michael Peachin, very few of the more than 700 pages develop on and discuss major issues such as social level and class and also demography. Those kind of meta questions have really a very little place within that work. And I think that's important to be aware of and think about for the study of early Christianity in general, but also particularly in relation to the apocryphal writings. There are a few exceptions to this state of the matter, however, and here I want to bring attention to one particular example of such an approach, and that is the book by Ramsay MacMullen, The Second Church, Popular Christianity, AD 200 to 400, which some of you may know. It's from 2009, yes. MacMullen bases his study and conclusions mainly on archaeology, and in particular on excavations of churches in various parts of the Greco-Roman world. He argues that the churches were able to accommodate only a very small number of people in comparison to the population as a whole, and also as compared to the assumed percentage of Christians in the population during this period. In his view, the church buildings primarily were the resort of the 5% Christian elite, the ecclesiastical establishment, if you can use that word, while the rest of the Christians, the 95% silent majority, belonging to the lower levels of society, many of whom were living in rural areas, practiced their Christian beliefs elsewhere. And MacMullen signals out the burial places and the martyr graves as the important places for these groups of early Christians. This is what he calls the second church, which has left very few traces in comparison to the Christian elite, who had by far most of the material resources. In his view, this second church needs to be uncovered and rehabilitated in order to get a more adequate understanding of early Christianity. In spite of some one-sidedness in MacMullen's approach, I think that he has made a strong case for his view. In my opinion, it is both necessary and useful to pay considerably more attention to the factor of social level in the study of the New Testament Apocrypha, and in a way similar to MacMullen, who, however, himself does not at all make use of the apocryphal material. So he doesn't mention it at all, in fact. Such an approach as MacMullen is, of course, not absolutely new. Modern scholarship has occasionally dealt with these matters, but several of those studies are now very old, even a century old and out of date, and also only to a very limited degree deal with the apocryphal sources and the infancy gospel material. Thus, this should be taken up in more breadth again, in my opinion. Both since we now have far more sources, both textual as well as material, to serve us in this, as compared to 100 years ago. And also since we have more developed tools from the social sciences than earlier generations of scholars had. So we have new ways of approaching this material, which we should make use of. In my view, such an approach may make it possible to explain some of the characteristics of the apocryphal material in more adequate ways. This does, of course, not mean that other approaches, such as ideology, gender, etc., should be toned down, but rather that it needs to be supplemented and nuanced through an approach focusing on social level. Thus, when we focus on the duality, canonical or non-canonical, and make use of the metaphor the other side, it can also make sense, in my opinion, to speak of not the one side or the other side only, but perhaps rather about the underside and the overside, or from below or from above. Theology, whether Christology, Mariology, or other, will very likely have looked different from below than from above. Social differences can very much throw light on and even explain differences in ideology, in our case also differences in theology. And I'm now soon going to go into a more experimental part of my lecture, which means that I haven't written everything out in full either, and I expect also to have some kind of response from you, at least after I've finished my talk. I'm going to enter into some material, texts from the Gospels. I call it circumstantial evidence, infancy gospel of Thomas and proto-evangelium of James. And just raise a question, how are we to go about when we want to interrogate into the social setting of these two stories? What can enable us to gain some insight into the contexts in which they have their origin? One of the main ways must, I think, be to make close readings of the texts themselves to see what they can reveal about social relations and structures. In doing this, there is, of course, always a risk of confusing or mixing up the narrative world of the texts with the real world behind them. The two may have very little relation to each other. Thus, we should generally be very attentive to this risk in our interpretation of texts. That is something we know from New Testament studies also very, very much. However, I believe that in many cases there will be fairly close links between the two, between the fictional world and the factual world, but perhaps in more hidden ways or implicit ways. But I think then, and I believe that the texts consequently often can be considered as windows that open into also the world behind them. What we need to make this possible, however, are some tools or questions which are adapted to the material and which can serve as some kind of indicators of social setting and social level. And together, hopefully, such indicators may even sum up to more than when dealt with only individually, as pieces in some kind of a jigsaw puzzle. I shall here try to do this or argue this by means of text examples from the two infancy gospels, one from each. I've chosen the texts because they are representative of each story and mirror a fairly similar situation, namely a setting in which social relations and not least social hierarchies come very much into play. In addition, by comparing the two texts, we can also the more clearly observe their distinctive character. By setting the two in relief to one another, we will observe that the differences between the two are in fact very marked when it comes to social contexts which they reflect. And the texts are PJ 8, chapter 8.6 to 9:12, Mary at 12 in the temple, and IGT, chapter 6.8 to 7.2, Jesus and his first teacher, which you have on the handout. I shall here primarily deal with the differences when I go through the material. Given the time restriction, we can, of course, not develop on this matter in detail. I shall focus on 6 points in the text themselves, and here leave out the 7th, which you have on the handout, which has to do with reception history. The reception history would need a treatment of itself, I think, but this will not be here. You have the paper or the text on the handouts. I wonder, would you have 1 or 2 minutes just to read it through so they have it present in your minds? Then I will shut up and you can just read. First, I would like to focus on the matter of style, which does not really come very much through in these translations into English. If you had seen the Greek, I could compare the Greek, you would see things more clearly. But already by a look at or a superficial look at these passages, we see some notable differences, which then would be even more evident if we had the Greek texts in front of us. And style is a big difference. PJ has a much more literary and polished style than IGT. IGT is paratactic, orally colored, and except for some part, simpler in style and language, except for some examples where difficult words, which we will come back to also later. The difference in style, a relatively high style in PJ and a fairly simple style language in IGT. A likely inference from this is that the two texts reflect different levels of literary training. possibly also differences in strategies of mediation. It is interesting to observe that whereas the text of the PJ, the Proto-Evangelium, in the manuscript tradition is much more stable, there are less changes in the texts among the manuscripts, whereas in the IGT tradition there are big differences in the manuscripts, so that it's sometimes difficult to say what is the relationship between those texts. And this may point to some kind of a way, both of a style and also of a mediation, that the PJ very much seems like a written piece of text, a literary product, whereas the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the IGT, varies much in the presentation and seems in many ways to have an oral character. It's more dependent on oral tradition and changes taking place during oral transmission. This does not necessarily mean that PJ has more command of language than IGT, but rather that they communicate on different wavelengths. IGTs play, for example, on words and sounds in the explanation of the alpha, which you read here, is also advanced, but in a different way than the PJ, and with quite a lot of humor, in fact, I think, involved. Second, after style, educational level, which is clearly related also to the matter of style, of course, and language. We can see from the texts that the PJ has much or shows much more knowledge of, for example, Judaism and Jewish rituals. From the description you see in the text, quite precise descriptions. In IGT, we find very little similar to this at all. Very little, even though it deals with the childhood of Jesus, there is really very little which connects it in any way with Palestine or Jesus' original place of childhood or his childhood area. We also see this difference in what kind of literature the writings reflect, knowledge of other kinds of literature. PJ seems in one way to be familiar with the Greek novels, the stories, romances, Greek romances, whereas IGT shows little knowledge of stories, of anything literary, apart from the New Testament Gospels or stories from the New Testament Gospels. And when IGT, for example, uses philosophical words or concepts, it's used with little precision. So there are clearly differences here in their background, which has also to do with educational level. Third, intertextuality, which also, of course, has a relationship to the former point on the matter of educational level. As when it comes to intertextuality, PJ is very rich, with many references, particularly to biblical matters and passages, but also to a number of secular literature of other kinds. Here, PJ clearly reflects an intellectual milieu in which the Bible and other literature played a central part. We can see it from the text examples with the reference to the high priest, the 12 bells, the Holy of Holies, the story also, or the mention of the doe that came out of Joseph's staff and perched on his head, which is some kind of a reminder or flashback to Jesus' baptism, maybe. We also hear about the Old Testament stories at the end of the text sample, Dathan, Abiram, and Kore. Not very much known or well-known stories for many, but clearly well-known in PJ. It is interesting then to compare it or see how different also IGT is here. Biblical references can also be found in IGT, but are more rare and generally with less finesse. We see in the infancy gospel abstract or extract you have here about Jesus and the first teacher. We have a mention of Zacchaeus, the name of the teacher. We have the name in the New Testament, but that is of the tax collector, so he has changed job. We have a reference, or one of the very few citations, quotations from the New Testament, from 1 Corinthians 13, like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. But the reference is quite, I would say, little related to the text in Paul. And we also have some references in the infancy gospel of Thomas to John, probably at the end of this passage, with some kind of references to the gospel of John, question about where Jesus comes from, who sent him, and did he exist before the creation of the world. So there are big differences here. It is obvious that these differences reflect also differences in cultural and social contexts. Whereas the author of PJ is theologically and literary trained, IGT does not give very much evidence of this. But there are, as mentioned, some indications, as I've given examples of here. In addition to the biblical references, the IGT also demonstrates, I would say, considerable skills in storytelling and dramatizing, which also points to some kind of a tradition and cultural learning and intertextuality that it relates to. The lament of the teacher in chapter 7:2 is a scene that would be a gift, I think, to any storyteller or actor. And this speech, it also continues further on in the text. Okay, fourth point, the role of theology. This is also a important difference, but I will not develop much on it here. But it is clearly a difference here. In PJ, the special theological agenda, as mentioned, is more than visible. In nearly every second clause, the virginity and purity of Mary is argued. IGT has its theological agenda too, which is to show that Jesus is sent from God, that he already as a child is divine. He behaves, as I've tried to formulate it in my book, as a true child and a true God. True child and true God. But IGT is generally less insistent than PJ in its attempts at underscoring this. Both writings are doing theology, but it's not obvious, at least from a second century perspective, whether the one belongs more to one or the other side than the other gospel. One may, for example, question whether PJ's strong insistence on the virginity of Mary, not only before but also after the birth of Jesus, was at the time, second century, more orthodox than IGT's idea about, was at the time more unorthodox than IGT's idea about Jesus' divinity as a child. And if we compare the understandings of God and Jesus in these Gospels, for example, of God as punishing or revenging, PJ does not seem to fare better than IGT does with his strange picture or depiction of Jesus. Still, it is IGT's orthodoxy that has been problematized within research, not the orthodoxy of PJ. And then little on social world, my point 5. Here there are also considerable differences when you go into the text samples. Just to take a few small examples, brief examples. As for geographical setting, in PJ we are clearly placed within a specific social setting, in geographical setting in Judea. In IGT we are somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It's very openly described. As for occupational area or levels that I mentioned, we have Joseph as a good example in both texts, which is also interesting to see how he is placed socially in the texts. In the PJ, we see that Joseph, he threw down his carpenter's axe and left for the meeting with the high priests. And at the end of the story, he talks to Mary, and he says, and he follows what he has been asked to do, and he says to Mary, "Mary, I've gotten you from the temple of the Lord, but now I'm leaving you at home." So it's no problem of him offending her virginity. And he says, "I'm going away to build houses, but I'll come back to you." Here, Joseph looks like some kind of an entrepreneur who builds houses and has an important job there. He will be away for a long time. If you go and have a look then instead on the Joseph on the Infancy Gospel Thomas, you will find Joseph in his small workshop, also working together with his son Jesus. Jesus helping him out of problems there. He's a carpenter working in the workshop, and he is in addition also a farmer. He does the land, sows the field together with Jesus also. So he lives some kind of a combined life of a carpenter and working up the land, a farmer. So there's some kind of a barter economy here. He needs to do both things to survive, make his family survive. On the area of urban-rural, we will also see, if we look at the text here and also the rest of the whole of the Gospels, we will see that PJ is very much or more focused on the temple and the city, Jerusalem, whereas what we find in IGT is village life and farmland very much, except for the final episode in Jerusalem with Jesus at 12. And when it comes to social institutions, we see that PJ deals with the temple, clerisy is mentioned, genealogy is important, being part of a family and family traditions, generations. In IGT, temple is mentioned, but we have little else of mention of social institutions beyond the core family. No church, no synagogue, not anything like that at all. We could not expect a church at Jesus' time, but we could expect it at the time of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. But no synagogue mentioned. So that clearly difference here in how the social world is painted. Final point before I go to my conclusion, which has to do with authority and social hierarchy. The most interesting difference perhaps here between the two examples has to do with how the figures there relate to authorities and authority figures and to social hierarchies. In PJ, such hierarchies are more pronounced and in addition also very much complied to. Joseph is here in every way possible, whether due to a carrot or to a stick, obedient towards the authorities. He does as the high priest and also by extension God says. He's obedient. And as a consequence of this, his mission in the scheme of salvation is fulfilled. There is here and scarcely elsewhere in PJ any kind of tension or protest against authorities. Being rich and being of an honorable family are virtues that are highly prized. Not so in IGT, and not with its Jesus. Here he competes with a teacher who is a social superior, an authority figure, and also an older person, which is important, and he defeats him to the degree that the teacher in his lament humiliates himself in the face of his audience. And the audience is both the audience in the narrative and the implied audience of the story, people like us. So the conflict forms part, and this conflict between Jesus and the teacher also forms part of a larger pattern which we see in IGT of situations in which Jesus challenges authorities, such as in his conflict with not the high priest, but the son of the high priest, Annas, and also in the conflict with his own father. In his behavior in this particular passage, but also elsewhere, Jesus not only demonstrates his wisdom and divinity, he also serves as a model for the addressees of the story. That is at least my contention. He is giving them a reason for, or at least a wish for, or a dream of, confronting and overturning the powerful. Read this way, this passage and also other passages indicate that IGT may at least reflect ideas and attitudes, and possibly also theologies of another kind than the proto-evangelium. And then some concluding remarks, if it still can stand more. What conclusions do I draw from my presentation and from this text sample? Even though I have here admittedly dealt with a very limited amount of material, I shall still venture a few claims. First, I think that the Gospels give important evidence of the considerable impact that social setting has had on the form as well as the contents of these stories. Both the texts themselves and their history of reception give us many good reasons for holding that they reflect the social contexts within which they were produced. The depiction of gender is a good example of this. In the Gospels, depictions of Jesus and Mary, but also other figures, female or male. Second, and building on this, I think that we can say that these two infancy Gospels, in spite of their many common features, are also in central respects quite dissimilar. They are clearly driven by different theological concerns. At the same time, they also appear to reflect different social spheres, and I would maintain even different social levels. In my view, there is very likely a correspondence between their respective theological concerns and the social settings each of them reflect. Indeed, I would be surprised if there are not close links between their ideological superstructure and their specific social settings, although I cannot here expand in detail on the character of these links, what these links are. Furthermore, to maintain that the Proto-Evangelium of James belongs to the main side, the mainstream, and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas to the other side, is in my opinion also not to the point. Such a classification would be, I think, anachronistic of these two second-century stories. Instead, it may be more fitting to say that the Proto-Evangelium of James is more likely to belong to the establishment church and the Infancy Gospel of Thomas to the second church. If this is so, it will also be useful to adjust our use of metaphors and speak of PJ and IGT as representing the overside from the above perspective and the underside from below perspective, respectively. Although this is obviously an oversimplification, so that we should also speak about oversides and undersides, it may nonetheless serve as a model, a paradigm that can further our understanding of these stories, and possibly also of other kinds of apocryphal material. The fact that PJ has had a successful reception history, not least in art, but also in the manuscript tradition, whereas IGT has been living more in the shadows, can in itself be evidence of the different social settings to which they may have belonged. Finally, as for what perspectives the authors or creators of these apocryphal infancy gospels might have had on the theological orthodoxies or orthodoxy of their time is hard to say. Possibly to speak of orthodoxy or the like would be quite foreign to them. But none of them seem to have intended to compete with or correct the traditions, the biblical and Christian, which they were building on. Instead, they both appear to have been very orthodox, at least in intent. They wanted to underscore the divine character of Mary's birthing of Jesus and the divine character of Jesus even as a child. In that sense, we may say that both infancy gospels contributed to developments that led to what in later centuries can be labeled as Christian orthodoxy. And with this, I thank you for your attention and open up the floor for questions, comments, and discussion.